Welcome to Issues That Matter. My guest today is Scott Ritter, and Scott and I are going to be talking about the situation between the war between Ukraine and the Soviet Union. But it seems like it's widening than that, right? What do you think?
Well, fortunately, right now it's purely a military conflict between Ukraine and Russia. Um, Ukraine has and continues to receive considerable military assistance and economic assistance from Western nations, primarily NATO, but also non-NATO members like Sweden and Finland are providing weaponry. Um, and there's a real risk that this could lead to a situation where Russia viewed the Western nations as directly intervening in its military operation. And the Russian President, Vladimir Putin, has been quite clear on what the consequences of that would be, which would
And
be a wider war.
okay, when you say a wider war, there's different aspects. And people think of maybe a doomsday scenario. Do you think it would come to that?
I don't believe that the Russians would start off with a nuclear strike against NATO. I think Russia would make NATO feel pain um, by destroying whatever um, forces were in Western Ukraine. And if they were aircraft, attacking and destroying the bases where those aircraft operated from. Um, and to be honest, at some point in time, if the provision of anti-tank and anti-aircraft missiles causes significant harm to Russia, Russia would be every bit in its rights under international law to blow up the locations in Poland or Romania where these weapons were coming from. So I think that would be the first step. And then the question is, how does NATO respond? If NATO responds with a large scale mobilization and large scale intervention, then yeah, now we're talking the great potential for a thermonuclear exchange.
Okay, let's go back to the basics. Um, Give us an overview of NATO. It started after the Second World War. Why did it start, and who's in NATO?
Well, NATO was the military extension of Western Europe's efforts to rebuild itself in the aftermath of the Second World War. You had the Marshall Plan, which was the American provision um, of aid to assist Europe in the reconstruction of their devastated cities and infrastructure. Several Western NATO countries felt that they needed to create a military alliance because they were individually so weak, and they felt that there was a need for collective defense. And I can't, off the top of my tongue, I can't remember the name of this alliance, but this alliance grew into uh, NATO. It morphed into NATO. The United States took the lead in transitioning away from a purely um, Central Western Europe framework into a transatlantic alliance that mirrored the economic alliance. There's always been a very close relationship between the military aspects of NATO and the economic aspects of America's relationship with Europe, and indeed Europe's relationship with itself. The European Union is in many ways an economic mirror of NATO. They don't tend to deviate too far when it comes to the policy. The first Secretary General of NATO was a British general, and when someone asked him what was the purpose of NATO, he said, "Keep the Germans down, to keep the Americans in, and to keep the Russians out." And people need to understand at the beginning of NATO, Germany was a defeated nation.
Hmm.
I think a lot of people have forgotten that today, that they somehow feel Germany is this wonderful, great nation in the middle of Europe. No, Germany's a horrible country that, when it was possessed by the ideology of National Socialism, inflicted global conflict on the world. It was defeated an alliance that included the United States and the Soviet Union fighting together. They defeated Nazi Germany at great cost to the world. 23 to 30 million Russian or Soviet citizens lost their lives during that conflict. 12 to 15 million of them were soldiers fighting and dying in that conflict. This was not a small thing. It was big. And Germany was divided, occupied. In the East was the Soviet military. In the West were the Western powers, the United States, Great Britain, and France. And one of the big fundamental questions at the time is what to do about Germany. Do we unify them? Do we keep them separated? If we unify them, do we allow them to have a military? Do we allow them to have a viable economy? There were many people that said Germany should never be allowed to be an industrial nation again. It should be purely an agronomy-centric economy. So, this was the question. And then what also happened is the West was trying to impose a Marshall Plan solution to Russia and Eastern Europe that would have required Russia and the Eastern European countries to subordinate themselves to Western banking. And the Russians, the Soviets said, no, we're not playing that game. We won the war. You don't get to dictate the solutions to global conflict to us. We're not buying into your Bretton Woods system of global domination by the US dollar. And in response to this, an American diplomat named George Kennan wrote something called the Long Telegram. And it's been cited as the beginning of our policy of containment of the Soviet Union, where we recognized that the Soviet Union wasn't going to play our game. At the same time Kennan wrote this telegram, Winston Churchill was doing his little tour in the United States. And in Missouri, he gave a speech where he talked about an iron curtain is lowering down on Europe. And so Europe got caught up in this emotion of a Soviet threat. There was no Soviet threat. The Soviet Union wasn't threatening anything. They weren't threatening to come westward. They weren't threatening. They just wanted not to be dominated by the US dollar. But this is what NATO was created to do, is to keep the Russians out and the Germans down. How do you deal? Because now that you've decided to split with the Soviet Union and create this iron curtain, what do you do about a unified Germany? What do you do about a peace treaty? And the Soviets were continuously pressing the West for a peace treaty. We want a final peace agreement with Germany so that Germany could be unified, and then Europe can get on with the business of being Europe. Well, the West didn't like that because the West was casting the Soviets in a very bad light, negative light, et cetera. And I'm not here to defend the Soviets. They can do that themselves, or they could have. The Russians will now. But the point is, NATO was created on this artifice, this notion that we had to keep the Russians out. That's a flawed construct. That we had to keep the Germans down, but we didn't have a plan for anything other than keeping the Germans down and to keep the Americans in. America was a predominantly isolationist nation that wanted all of its boys to come home after the war. We didn't want to get caught up in another big European. So NATO was a hook to keep American troops on the ground, to keep the Germans occupied, and keep the Russians out. So that's what NATO was created to do. And then it began to expand. We allowed, because the Russians were involved in communist takeover in Greece, the Russians were making noise about wanting some lands from Turkey. We opened up NATO membership to allow Turkey and Greece in. We brought in Spain and Portugal. So NATO sort of solidified around 16 core nations that represented the front line against Soviet-dominated Europe and Eurasia. And that is, we sustained that from the 1950s on until the end of the Cold War in 1990, 1991. NATO was a very vibrant military alliance. Let's make no bones about it. In 1985, the most powerful military alliance in the world was the NATO military alliance. It had the most powerful militaries in the world, united, training together with common equipment, et cetera. Cost a lot of money to do that, by the way. But then something happened. The Berlin Wall came down. And now German unification was forced onto Europe. They'd avoided that issue because of the Cold War, because of Soviet East-West politics. But now with the Berlin Wall down, suddenly everybody had to say, whoa, what do we do about a united Germany? We hadn't even thought about this because Germany still scared the heck out of people. You know, there's a lot of people who say Germany shouldn't be united because Germany has some problems. You scratch a German, some people say, and you get a Nazi. This ideology of Aryan supremacy hasn't gone away. And if you empower them with, economic strength, industrial strength, and then you give them a reason to militarize, Europe could be facing the same problem that it faced twice last century. Germans on the march, not a good thing. And so the Russians said, the Soviets, Mikhail Gorbachev said, hey, here's the deal. I got 400,000 guys in East Germany. I ain't leaving. I don't care about the wall coming down. I don't care about any of that. I ain't leaving until you give me guarantees that if I withdraw, you don't move into the vacuum. Okay, I'll leave because we'll come up with a peace treaty with Germany. We'll reunify Germany, but I need a guarantee that you're not going to fill the vacuum with troops. And that guarantee was given. And then the Soviet Union collapsed, and the West suddenly forgot about that guarantee. And not only did we move troops into Eastern Germany, we then started an expansion of NATO, 5 phases of expansion that took it right up to the Russian border, absorbing almost the totality of the former Warsaw Pact. For what end? I mean, what is the purpose of NATO post-Cold War? The Germans are united. There is no more Soviet threat. The purpose of NATO is to keep the Americans in Europe. That's the real purpose of NATO today.
So it was expanded during Clinton's administration, right?
Well, Clinton began the political process of expansion, and he also initiated the initial tranche. Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, I believe, were brought in 1999 at the end of the Clinton administration. But the Bush administration continued it, and the Obama administration continued it. The Trump administration continued it. And the Biden administration has continued it. So no, it's been a continuity of purpose for the United States of America. It's not one president, it's all presidents have bought into the notion that American security is enhanced through its participation in a transatlantic alliance called NATO.
So since Putin's been the leader in Russia for 20 years now, he just didn't one day wake up and say, "Hey guys, you're choking me." This had to be a process where he felt more and more cornered. So can you talk about that particular scenario?
Sure. Well, let's start with Putin's predecessor, Boris Yeltsin, who was on the phone continuously with Bill Clinton and meeting with Clinton and begging Clinton not to expand NATO. Begging, pleading, and Clinton ignored him. There was the National Security Archives just recently, I think last year or the year before, published the transcripts of the telephone calls between Clinton and Yeltsin. And it's a very hard read if you understand anything about history and such to read Yeltsin pleading and being ignored by Clinton. Near the end of this, they have near the final conversations, they have the list of the participants in there. And one of the people listening to Yeltsin debase himself, humiliate himself, was a man named Vladimir Putin. Putin became president, and Putin said, never again. The first thing Putin tried to do is make peace with the West, saying, okay, you got this thing called NATO, and it's expanding. Why don't you let me in? I mean, if you guys are expanding because you're worried about me, just bring me in the club. Let me be a member. Then you don't have to worry about me. I'm a member. So, and he was rebuffed. I mean, he said that in his most recent speech. He said, I've never told anybody this before, but I approached Clinton and said, why don't you let me in? And Clinton responded by sending covert aid to the Chechen rebels to bleed the Russian army dry. That's how America responds. Now, even after that, Russia, wasn't saying war because Russia was too weak. Russia continued to say, we don't like this NATO expansion, but there wasn't much Russia could do. Russia had to rebuild. By 2007, Russia was starting to feel its oats. And Putin is 7 years into his presidency, and he gives a speech at the Munich Security Council, which is the premier geopolitical European security forum. All the major leaders come, and Putin spoke, and he told them. First of all, he said, we live in a world where one nation, the United States, does whatever it wants, goes to war whenever it wants, and bullies people. He said, no more. Those days are gone. We need to move away from a unipolar system to a multipolar system. And then he said, NATO expansion has threatened Russia's security. You must stop this nonsense. How did NATO respond? In 2008, they held a conference, I believe in Budapest. I could be wrong, could be Bucharest, one of the two B's, but where they formally invited Ukraine and Georgia to become members. After that, the Russians made their displeasure known, so much so that the U.S. ambassador to Russia at the time, a guy named William Burns, wrote a memorandum called "Niet means Niet," no means no. And he was explaining to everybody what the Russian position is. And in short, he said, the Russians have drawn a red line around Ukraine, and that if NATO continues to push for Ukrainian membership, Russia will have no choice. And this he wrote in 2009, February 2009, no choice but to resort to military action, which will mean the destruction of Ukraine. Crimea will become part of Russia, and so will the Donbass. And he predicted in 2009. Anybody who says we couldn't have seen this coming is lying, because our own ambassador wrote it out in black and white. And not only that, he said the Russians have a valid point here. This is a security problem for Russia. We must respect this. We ignored it. We continued to push. We continued to push. We continued to push. In 2014, the United States and the European Union supported a coup, what pretty much is a coup or an insurrection in Ukraine, the Maidan Revolution, they call it, which removed a democratically elected pro-Russian president from power and replaced him with this revolutionary movement that was heavily influenced by right-wing ultranationalist neo-Nazis. And this was a problem because they started to implement laws that banned Russian, and much of Ukraine is native Russian speakers. And many Russian communities broke up. There's a famous line where Putin, people say, Putin has said that the greatest calamity in the last 100 years was the collapse of the Soviet Union. Well, he did say that, but there's the second part of the story that puts it into proper perspective. Because it made tens of millions of Russians homeless. He wasn't bemoaning the collapse of a system that he despises. He's not pro-Soviet Union. Everybody says he wants to reconstitute the Soviet Union. They don't know what they're talking about. What he said, though, is that under the Soviet Union, Russians had gone to live in the various outlying nations of the Soviet Union and called that their home. And when the Soviet Union went away, these Russians were now homeless. And he said, that's the tragedy. And we have to protect these Russians. And I will be the man who protects them. So in Ukraine, when you have neo-Nazis come down to Odessa, shove 150 people into a building and set it on fire, killing almost 50 of them, when you have them slaughtering people in the streets of Kharkiv, when you have them slaughtering people in the Donbass, and then threatening to shut down Russian language in Crimea, which is almost 80% Russian, the Russians acted. They took over Crimea and said, well, we're going to solve this problem. This is now Russia. And they told the separatists in Donbass that while we won't support your independence, we will support your right to fight for your freedoms. And so you had these breakaway areas. But Russia didn't want to incorporate them. Russia kept saying, we want Ukraine to be a single entity. But what you need to do is have a peace agreement that respects the rights of the Russians. That was called the Minsk Agreement, 2015. Ukraine signed on to it. And Germany and France were guaranteeing it. But when the guy who signed it, I think his name is Poroshenko, the president, came back, the neo-Nazis told him that if he signs this, they'll kill him. Not we'll be against you, now we'll kill you, string you up. So they never signed it. Zelenskyy ran on a platform of peace with Russia. He got the most of the 80% of the Russian speakers in Ukraine voted for this man because he was going to bring them peace. But then Zelenskyy was told by the neo-Nazis that if you sign the Minsk agreement. If you put it into action, we will kill you. So the Nazis are bullying everybody. The Russian people continue to suffer, and NATO keeps making noise about expansion. People say, well, Ukraine wasn't a NATO member. What's the problem? They had an army over 260,000 strong that was trained as a NATO army, equipped as a NATO army, wore NATO uniforms. 20,000 NATO troops rotated through Ukraine last year. Ukrainian troops traveled to every NATO nation training with the others. It was a de facto proxy military force. And the Russians said, no. That's why when Putin speaks of two things, he says denazification, meaning he's going to eradicate this neo-Nazi ideology, and demilitarization. And what he means by demilitarization is destroying the NATO infrastructure inside Ukraine, destroying it. It will no longer exist. And then the third thing they're demanding is neutrality, permanent neutrality. And then the fourth thing is that whatever Ukrainian state exists, they have to recognize Crimea. But the bottom line is the Russians were pushed against the wall. We knew it and we kept pushing. And now we all go, oh my God, the Russians invaded Ukraine. What did you expect? What did you expect? They told you they were going to do this if you kept pushing. And now you cry foul when they actually do what they say they were going to do.
Now, when you put the TV on, they portrayed Putin to be the bully, and the Ukrainian president to be, poor Zelenskyy, but that's not the case. And the people in this country are falling for it. What do you say about that?
I mean, I'm not going to give Putin a complete pass here. He made the decision to go to war. I know he was pushed into it, but ultimately the decision was his. And, you got to own it. And he's owning it. He's not running away from it. He's not. I'll give him credit for that. But, Russia, you sent the tanks across, so be prepared for people to be upset. But Zelenskyy is this modern Churchill. Look, Zelenskyy is a comedian. That's all. He was never a politician. He played a politician on TV show. And the popularity of that TV show combined with the absolute horrific state of affairs in Ukraine, the most corrupt nation in Europe. Corruption is unreal, dominated by Nazis with no hope for peace. He was sponsored by the billionaire who owned the media empire where Zelenskyy played his shows. So Zelensky's this little sock puppet controlled by an oligarch who puts him in, funds his campaign, shapes public opinion using his media network, and then Zelenskyy gets elected. He was punching above his weight from the beginning. He was never qualified to be president. And today he still isn't. Everything you're hearing from this guy is written for CIA, which is working with the Ukrainian Ministry of Information to run what's called an information operation. You want the proof in the pudding? I'll give you three things. Snake Island. You remember that? The 13 sailors, the Russian ship came up and said, surrender. And they said, stick it in your beep, Russia. And everybody, oh my God, these are the bravest people in the world. Never happened. There were 82 Marines on the island. The Russians said, surrender. They surrendered. That's the truth. But the CIA spun it to be something else. The coast of Kiev, while the Ukrainian Air Force is getting blown out of the sky, the CIA creates this mythical Red Baron type figure who's flying over Kiev, shooting down Russian airplanes by the bushel-full, the coast of Kiev. So everybody's going, oh my God, the Ukrainians are such great fighters. And then the famous a quote from Zelenskyy about, I don't need a ride, I need ammunition.
Right.
Never said it. The only quote you'll find about it is a quote from an anonymous U.S. intelligence source who says Zelenskyy said it. Even Zelensky's people won't say he said it. It was written by the CIA. Which is okay. Information operations is an old intelligence game. I used to play it too. But they had the U.S. media, journalists, exclusively buying into this as the only news feed, not even asking where the source is from, even when it's discredited, like the Snake Island 13 guys. We all now know that's a lie. Even the Ukrainian government had to say, oops, no, that was a lie. They still play it over and over again as if it's some sort of rallying cry. The media has become an extension of a CIA information operation. That's
Wow.
just the sad truth.
Mm-hmm. Wow. So do you think this is going to be pretty protracted? Think it's going to last a while?
No, I don't. I think, I mean, you see, again, remember, most Americans are watching TV going, what are you talking about? Ukrainians are killing those Russians by the bushel. We got fields full of destroyed Russian tanks. Zelensky's a man, and all this stuff. The Ukrainian army is dead and dying, and more are going to die. It's being ground into raw meat and being fed to dogs. The Russian army is working its way up. It's almost surrounded. It's on the outskirts of Kiev. You've got the American government talking about how they're going to replace Zelensky when he dies. I mean, there's your vote of confidence for you. America's your friend, buddy, but they're already working on your replacement to set up an exile government in Poland once Kiev falls, because it's going to fall. It's all going to fall. It will be bloody. The Ukrainian people are going to suffer tremendously. Millions more refugees are going to pour across the border. It's going to be a humanitarian calamity like we've never seen. But the Russians are going to win. This isn't going to drag out forever. Now, people keep talking about the resistance.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if there's going to be a big resistance. Yes, there'll be a couple guys that run around and try and kill Russian tanks with Molotov. They'll die. And at some point in time, I think most people are going to realize that if you are in the resistance, you die. That's the outcome. You tend to resist when there's hope. Resistance isn't some futile thing, because then it becomes a suicide mission. And the thing about a suicide mission is once everybody commits suicide, nobody else wants to come in and take over. So, I think there will be no hope. They're going to create this fake government in exile. Nobody's going to rally around it besides NATO countries who are going to fund it. But it's not going to become anything, because Russia is going to crush the resistance. They're going to denazify and demilitarize. So when you denazify, you take away the mystique of this ultra nationalism. That's what I think is going to happen, and I think it's going to be done sooner rather than later.
So Scott, our time is just about up, and you shed so much light on the problem that you won't get on the mainstream media, and I am sure that we will talk again. So you've been listening and watching to Scott Ritter. This is um, this is issues that matter. So we will talk again, Scott. Thank you so much, and have a great day, everybody.